I am Pronab Sen. I used to be the principal economic advisor to the Indian Planning Commission for about 14 years, covering 4 5-year plans. And then I was the Chief Statistician of India for a while. What I'll be speaking about is the Indian economy, not the way it is today. I think that is still under discussion, and there's a lot of commentary going on. But something that we really haven't had in a while, which is a vision for where we want to be several years, maybe a decade, 2 decades into the future. And what do we need to do today to get to that vision? In a sense, I'm drawing on my experiences as a planner and as the custodian of economic data in India. At the moment, I think we are all very, very preoccupied with the slowdown that's taken place in the economy. And there is, I think, a very lively debate that is on. But in all of that, what we haven't actually noticed is the simple fact that our focus has really shifted to the here and now, and not where we want to be, not what we want to leave for our children. But in a sense, that is, I think, the function of people who are at senior levels in government and outside government who are concerned about the country. The today, of course, is important, but tomorrow by far more so. So let me just reflect a little bit about the trajectory of economic development that we had set for ourselves. I won't go back into far history. I'm not going all the way back to the planning process which started in the early 50s, but to something which is of more recent origin. Let's think about the post-1991 period, which is post-liberalization, where we actually chalked out a new game plan for the Indian economic system. During the course of these 24 years, or no more, 28 years, one thing has been really quite remarkable. If you think about the process, it all began with a Congress government. Then in the middle, for a while, there was a United Front government. Then you had one short stint of a BJP government. Then you had NDA-1. NDA-1 went out. You had UPA-1, which was a Congress government. You had UPA-2, which was Congress Redux. Then you had NDA-2, which is continuing. During all of this change in political parties, in the ideologies that were being represented in government, the one thing that stood out, which people may not have noticed, is that the plans that we had made ourselves, which were the vision for the country and the roadmap for attaining that vision, were never, ever changed, even when the government changed to another political party with a very, very different political and economic philosophy. So what seems to be pretty clear to me, at least, is that there is a fair degree of unstated unanimity in terms of where we think we want to go and how we wish to get there. The problem, of course, is it is not documented as of now, but I think the trend continues. A lot of the problem, therefore, is really about putting flesh on those desires. I think that commonality exists and will continue to exist, but it's the way we think about it and the way we plan out the kind of strategies that we need to keep the economy on the kind of growth path that we think is desirable. So what are these commonalities that we are talking about? And I think there are a few important strands which we need to again bring right back up into popular discourse. The first is I think there is a clear understanding that India is going to be an economic system which is driven primarily by private enterprise. I think that is now completely accepted. The second is we want an economy where the benefits of development and growth reach down to the poorest in the country, so that the process of moving up the economic ladder is not a process where people lose touch with those who are immediately below them, but that continuity flows as everybody moves up together. This was, I think, the second part of the vision. The third part of the vision was that as an economic system, we were, and we continue to be, rather inefficient in the way we use our resources. And that increase in the efficiency of resources is of the highest importance. So that when we are looking into the future, 15, 20 years down into the future, what we are looking at is a vibrant entrepreneurial culture in the country in which the entrepreneurship reaches down to the lowest and the poorest segments of our society. It's a system where everybody is conscious of the need to improve efficiencies so that our resources, which are in fact fairly scarce, are used far more productively than they are today or have been in the past. And in all of this, the role of the government is essentially to guide, to assist, and to fill in the gaps as and when those gaps appear. So if this is the vision we share, the real question that comes is how do we get this entrepreneurial movement going? And here there is good news. India is inherently an entrepreneurial country. Most people have no idea as to the extent of entrepreneurial activity that exists. When we think of entrepreneurs in India, or indeed for the most part in the world, one always thinks of the corporates. And how many corporates do we have? If you go by the stock exchange, you're looking at maybe 3,000, 4,000 companies. Then you go one step below that and ask how many are actually registered as companies, and there are 1.3 million. Right? Now, 1.3 million itself is a fairly impressive figure. But that's not where entrepreneurship stops. In India, in 2014, we carried out an economic census. It's a door-to-door survey asking every building the question, is any economic activity carried out? If yes, then further questions were asked, as in any census. In 2014, there were 58 million non-farm enterprises in the country. And the estimate that we got was that this was increasing on the average by about 2 million a year. So that now that we are 5 years down the road, it's no longer 58 million, it's probably closer to 67, 68 million. So you have 67, 68 million entrepreneurs of varying sizes and varying capabilities. But that's not the end of the story. There is a very unfortunate tendency among people to think of farmers as some kind of a subspecies. But anybody who has ever done farming or knows anything about farming knows that it is possibly the most entrepreneurial activity a human being can carry out. the kind of risk bearing that takes place, the kind of decision making that takes place, the way crop decisions are taken, the way pesticide decisions are taken. There's a huge range of moving parts in agriculture which doesn't exist in industry. Industry is a much simpler game. Farming is far, far more difficult. Last count, there were about 72 million farms in India. So add 72 to 68, and what you get is 140 million entrepreneurial active institutions in the country, which has only 270 million households, which means that 1 in every 2 households, there is some entrepreneurial activity going on. So worrying about whether we have entrepreneurship or not, I think, is really a waste of time. We have it. The important question then becomes, how do we get and how do we enable these inherent entrepreneurs to do better, to grow, to become more efficient, to become more productive, to become more profitable? That is the economic challenge. Now, when we think about it that way, there are many, many things that need to be done. But the first and the foremost is to recognize that entrepreneurship, which is really at the grassroots level, require a different mode of thinking in terms of how you support them than the way you would think of a corporate. The ball game is different. The markets that are being addressed are different. Their competitive strategies are different. So you need to think differently. You cannot think about one size fits all. This is a challenge that has existed for a while, and we have taken various steps in this direction. In a sense, if you again think about what has been happening over the past, some of the major challenges that are being faced by the small entrepreneurs have been addressed sequentially. To give you an instance, if you think of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the first reaction that people have is that this is a dole. It's a pure income support scheme for the poor rural worker. At one level, that is certainly true. There's no question about it. But at another level, it does something which is far more interesting and far more impactful. And that is, it provides the average Indian small farmer the backstop he requires to take further risks. And what are these risks? The main risk is we do know, for instance, that we are already in a situation where we are producing somewhat excessive amounts of rice and wheat. These are now unremunerative crops. We want farmers to shift to more remunerative crops and crops for which the demand is growing on a daily basis. So if you look at the growth rate of demand for wheat and rice, it's barely above 1% a year. So it's lower than the population growth rate. But if you look at the demand for fruits and vegetables, the horticultural products, that's growing at about 5 to 6%. Prices are much higher. You want farmers to shift, but the small farmer does not have the risk-taking capacity to make this shift unless he is backstopped in some manner. MGNREGS did and does exactly that. And if you really look at the data that we have, the pace at which shifts have taken place in cropping patterns has accelerated post NREGS. It was possibly not the original intent, but when you think about it, it was a novel way of promoting entrepreneurship. Then let's think about the next level of entrepreneurs, which are the small shops who are doing various sorts of things, small artisanal activities. Most of our reactions in terms of these kinds of things is the problem that they face is access to capital, investment funds for them. And there's been a whole slew of schemes to provide bank loans and other formal loans to this category of people. The latest of which was the Mudra loan scheme of the government. But then, we've had things like loan melas and all sorts of interventions to do this. That's fine in and of itself. The question, of course, is that all they need? Is there an issue in their risk-taking abilities that will allow them to do the kind of scaling up, take the kind of risks that we need them to take? And the answer is no, it isn't. Because at the end of the day, they need the assurance that if their enterprise fails, they will not starve to death. We don't have this in place. NREGS did it for the farmers, but it certainly hasn't done anything for the non-farming entrepreneur. It's something we need to think about. We also need to think about the fact that most small entrepreneurs in India operate in very, very localized markets, so that they become, in an important sense, hostage to the kind of growth that is taking place in that very small localized area. So in a sense, poverty will feed on itself and make the entrepreneur less productive and less profitable. But there will be other pockets where, because there is a positive economic dynamic, both the small entrepreneur and the local area grows. If we want to really get the kind of leverage we want, we need to be able to connect these areas up better. In a sense, we've done some of that as well. The National Highway Program is where it all really began and had a tremendous amount of effect, certainly on urban India, but also on the periphery of the national highways. That is, villages which were close to the national highways. The second round, which was in fact turned out to be far more impactful, was the Rural Roads Program. The Rural Roads Program was amazing. The Rural Roads Program actually spread this out into the hinterland. But it spread it out in a very, very specific way. What it allowed was the connectivity between the village and the nearest town. What it didn't allow was connectivity between the villages. Now, that sounds like a perfectly reasonable game plan. If you connect them to a town, you're expanding their market, you're expanding their opportunities. But this is a very urban mindset, the way you and I will think about it. If you think about it in terms of the villager and the village craftsman or the village service person, the needs he is addressing, the aesthetics he is dealing with, are those of other villages. They are not of townsfolk. Connecting villages to villages has barely begun. But that really is the next big step. The one great change that has happened, and this is not in India, it's across the world, is the information revolution. We know that telephone connectivity in India has surprised everybody. Nobody ever thought that a country as poor as India, with such glaring income disparities, would end up overtaking everybody else in terms of telephone penetration. We've done that over a very, very short period of time. So at one level, it's an indicator of the kind of yearning that existed in rural India for communications. At another level, it represents an enormous opportunity for us to be able to create the kind of connectivity, not just get, to create the kind of connectivity that will make small entrepreneurship far more viable than it is today. In order for that to happen, one really needs to think about content. For the longest time, people who have lived long enough will remember that when our television network started in India, one of its core programs was something called Krishi Darshan, which was a program to impart, or not even, it wasn't actually imparting, it was familiarizing farmers with new technology. The actual details of the technology and how it worked, of course, was done by the agricultural extension system. But to know that a technology exists itself is a huge, huge first step. Today, our ability to do something similar for a whole range of economic activities that are carried out by small entrepreneurs has expanded because of the telephone penetration, provided we are clear in our minds as to the kind of information that needs to be conveyed. Unfortunately, this is not happening. The telephone has actually helped in certain directions. For instance, now a lot of small enterprises scattered across India, some in rural India, have started coming on to e-commerce platforms. But that's only on the sales side. Equally important are what are the opportunities for developing the range of products, what are the technologies that are available for improving their productivity. This information is still very hard to come by. That's one side of the story. There is another side, which is, at the end of the day, economic systems are about transactions. I produce, I sell to you. It's that transaction which creates an economic system. Those transactions are facilitated by some medium of exchange, money. This is something we need to think about very, very carefully, for the very simple reason we have seen the kind of damage that can happen once the transactional platform is disrupted. This happened during demonetization and during the GST. If you look at our discourse, we keep discussing the issue of whether or not there is enough liquidity for corporate India. Has anybody ever asked, is there enough liquidity for the farmer? Is there enough liquidity for the small businessman? Nobody seems to ask that question. And even if you do, you have a bit of a problem, which is you don't have the foggiest idea as to how to get that liquidity out to them. But if you don't, then transactions don't happen, and if transactions don't happen, economic activities slow down. That's one aspect which we need to come back to. The second part of it is that in a country, in any country, particularly a country like ours, which is an underdeveloped country, where our physical connectivities are still weak, most of our producers are extremely small, we need to think seriously about the role of the trading sector in the country. By and large, again, this is an urban mindset, but it exists in the rural areas in a completely different form. But in both cases, the trading community in India is not seen in very good light, I'm afraid. They are essentially seen to be oppressive. They are seen to be leeches on society. What people forget are really the functions that they carry out and what would happen if those functions were not carried out. So by all means, have whatever preconceived notion you may have about traders in India. But by having a view on the trader, do not damn the activity, because that activity is the lifeblood of an economic system. And we haven't seriously, we've talked about it. We've talked a lot about how connecting farmers directly to the consumers. We had a great deal of expectations from organized retail that they would actually go down to the farm level, pick up the produce and bring it to your doorstep. Technology permits all of that to happen. However, the experience there has been fairly clear. These companies certainly do not go down to the farm. The lowest that they will go down to is the mandi. So between the farmer or the small producer in the village and the market yard, there is a huge gap which has to be filled and will not be filled by organized retail. And that is something we need to think about very carefully, which again we haven't, and that's something that we have to put in place as a strategy. The point is that when you put all these bits and pieces together, what you're talking about is a process of integration of an economic system which has otherwise been fragmented for various reasons. Historical, geographic, and infrastructural deficiencies. This is the issue that we need to get our heads around, and we need to have a working game plan on it. Because to solve one problem and not solve another problem doesn't really help. I mean, this is like, if you say that I'm going to give you a bank loan, but I'm not going to give you the market connectivity, that bank loan might as well not be there. It makes no difference whatsoever, and vice versa. Because all of these ultimately have to come in packages, and we have to think about it in terms of packages, not in terms of individual schemes which are addressing one problem or another with a completely non-coordinated choice of where what happens. This is what we've been witnessing for a while, and this is something we need to change, and we need to change it now. Thank you. Well, it's a great question. The issue is when you liberalize, it actually opens opportunities for all. The problem is that the majority of our enterprises are unable to tap into that opportunity. So it's only a small fraction who can take advantage of it. And that's what is creating this widening gap, right? That is not a condemnation of the liberalization in itself. It's a condemnation of two things. First is the inability, our inability, to be able to get the connections and the linkages that allow a much wider set of entrepreneurs to engage. That's the fault, and it's an internal fault. The second is the timing. That is, are you liberalizing in a situation where you know that very, very few organizations will be able to take advantage of it? Because in all of these processes, good ideas also need to be implemented only at appropriate times. A good idea implemented in an inappropriate time can be just as damaging as a bad idea. And I would submit to you, the problem is that liberalization is a good idea. Was it implemented at an inappropriate time? No. The point is the trajectory that came after that was based on just the process of liberalization without necessarily getting all the other things fixed. The failure lies there. It doesn't lie in the liberalization process itself. So the first and most important, of course, is connectivity. The second is the way we think about our financial system. By and large, the banks will lend to small entrepreneurs. These are only working capital loans. They are only against collateral, and there are fixed limits. So if you're selling in a localized area, your turnover time is fairly short. But if you are to take advantage of the liberalization process, where you're now talking about a much larger geographical area with much longer lead times between the process of production and its subsequent realization as a sale, this lengthens quite a bit. So if you think about a corporate, the banks give him 4 months of packing and export credit. If you're a small businessman, you won't get it. Right? Now, those are the problems that need to be fixed. Those are first, they need to be identified, and then they need to be fixed. Well, you see, the first two, I think, are really important, which is identity. Now, not just any identity, but an identity which is unique. Identity which is portable. I think there's absolutely no doubt that's essential. The second, the stack is also important because what you are doing is you're easing the process of transaction. It is the process of financial transaction that's being eased. The problem that I was referring to is not that. The real problem is the process of physical transaction. Now, if I don't lick that problem, then I may be able to get the payments problem sorted out, but it doesn't allow me to access the opportunities where they arise, not when, but where, because those are geographically limited. That is the infrastructure issue, but it's more than an infrastructure issue. Think of somebody who needs to sell a product in a particular geography in order for him to be able to access the global market, which is what liberalization does. Who does he get in touch with? This is where I was talking about the trader. This is where traders become important. So if you think about it, trading houses used to be a very big thing. One doesn't hear about trading houses today. Why? Because a lot of that space has been taken over essentially by other corporates. The trading houses, on the other hand, were working with SME units. They were acting as aggregators. They were acting as brand builders and were exporting. That system seems to be breaking down today. No, the question, of course, is, do we want to revive them? So as I said, I was putting out the issues. I'm not necessarily giving answers.
Yeah,
right? Now the point of all of this is that if you think about, let's say, agricultural enterprise, each individual farmer produces, I'm talking about the small farmer, I'm not talking about the Punjab farmers, would be producing about maybe somewhere around half a ton of produce. All right? That's not enough for you to transact with any large corporation. So what you have is a trader who is an aggregator, who's taking up a whole bunch of these, half-ton lots, putting them together so he gets at least a truckload and transports it. These are systems that will need to exist. They do exist. They exist in limited directions. But these are precisely the systems that need to be thought through, because you need to think about it in terms of end-to-end connectivity, end-to-end transaction processing, not somewhere in the middle. I mean, this is like constructing a Delhi-Mumbai highway and it's stopping on the outskirts of Delhi and outskirts of Bombay and say, ki hamara kaam ho gaya. It doesn't work like that. It has to be end-to-end. And these are things that have to be thought about. We need to look for who are the ones who are capable of providing it and what do we need to get them to do so. That's the kind of game plan that is needed. Look, the planning process needed change. I don't think there's any question about that. The problem, of course, is the Niti Aayog has done no planning at all. Because if it had, I would not be standing here talking about our vision for the future, about the commonality, about this convergence of views that you mentioned. I wouldn't need to talk about it. It would already be there. It would not again be a matter of discussion in the Brains Trust. In fact, if you look at what Prime Minister Modi directed Niti Aayog to do, was to come out with a 15-year vision, a 7-year strategy, and a 3-year action plan. We haven't seen any of those. We've seen a bit of an action plan. But to have an action plan in the absence of a strategy or a vision seems really to put the cart before the horse. I don't think feeding ourselves is really a big issue. If you look at our agricultural productivity, and this is why I kept repeating and stressing on productivity, if you look at our agricultural productivity on a crop by crop basis, we are somewhere between 50 to 70% of what China does. So the technology exists. But technology is only as useful as, number one, the technology getting transferred, and number two, the wherewithals that make that technology effective being provided. We have a long way to go. And over the foreseeable future, I don't see that as being a really serious problem. What is a problem and will be a problem is that the way your demand is going to grow is going to keep changing. And if your agricultural production pattern doesn't change in step with that, you will see shortages emerging, and we've seen it several times. Shortages emerging in various areas, prices shooting up, those sorts of things will happen. But there is no danger that we will not have enough food to feed ourselves. at least a basic level. There are, as far as the, what should I say, the quality of life that people will have is determined by a very large number of factors. The first and foremost, of course, is income earning opportunities, which you talked about. Now, today, as I said, we have too many entrepreneurs and too few workers. And the reason for that is a lot of people who wanted to be employees didn't get jobs and had to perforce become entrepreneurs. Right? That's not a desirable state of affairs, because what that is a distress entrepreneurship. Ideally, you would want to move to a situation where we would have fewer entrepreneurs, so that there would be a process of attrition among entrepreneurs, which is what any market economy does. But each entrepreneur would be employing several more people than he's employed today. So those who are quitting entrepreneurship would then get work with a more successful entrepreneur. That is the process. All right? Now, is that a process that you can hasten? Is that a process you should hasten? Or is it a process that is essentially organic? That's a call you have to take. And here, the question of levelization is something that needs to be debated very carefully. Do you really want levelization, or do you want the market to do what markets are supposed to do, which is weed out the inefficient and encourage the more efficient to grow? Are we permitting that to happen? And the answer is perhaps not. Well, the state of our education, the state of skilling, that's a different ballgame, and that we can discuss if you like. But the first question, I think, is more tractable. If you really think about what is happening, I mean, why are we not being able to export? There are several reasons. The first reason is that please go and look at what the wage rates are for the same activity in different parts of the country. If you go to the area, by the way, let's take textiles and garments. You know, everybody thinks we are doing so terribly in textiles and garments. We are the second largest producers of textiles and garments in the world. All right? We just don't export very much of it. There's enough demand in the country to make us the second largest. Question: why aren't we exporting? Why aren't we scaling it up? And the reason is that if you are a textile factory located in UP or Bihar, where labor is cheap, your cost of getting that product out as exports is simply too high for you to compete. On the other hand, if you are located on the outskirts of Chennai or Mumbai or Surat, where the cost of exporting is relatively low, the wage rates are high. So now the whole question, look, China faced the same problem. How did they solve it? They moved 100 million people. Are you going to do that? Can you do it? And much more importantly, ethically, should you do it? If not, rethink your game plan. Now, insofar as the whole education and skilling is concerned, education is bad news. We all know that. The ASER reports have been coming out regularly showing that how poor the learning outcomes are. So we are getting very dramatic increases in both enrollments and number of years in school. Very dramatic. The problem, of course, is that the learning outcomes aren't great. Now, this is a problem that really needs to be fixed. I am not an educationist. I can't weigh in on this. but clearly it's calling out for something to be done. Skilling is a different thing altogether. The real issue is that you have two kinds of skilling processes. One is formal skilling, where you train people on a specific set of competencies. All right? Those competencies have to be generic enough so that there's enough demand in the market. And so far, the only place where we've been able to find that kind of sort of stable demand for skilled personnel is in construction. So skilling in construction is not bad. All other forms of skilling are much more specific. Now, in the Indian system, the way skilling has worked is it's the small entrepreneur who would be hiring an unskilled worker, would put him through on-the-job training. Once that person reached a certain level of competency, he got bought up by a larger unit. So it's the big fish eat small fish kind of thing going on. That process was working well. But if you think about it, that process works well if and only if the rate at which the small units are producing skilled workers is higher than the rate at which the large corporates are buying them up. Moment that balance gets tilted, it breaks down. That's where we seem to be today. I mean, it is not a coincidence that several major economic activities in this country are located in very specific areas. There are specific communities which over the years, through skilling and reskilling, have developed into major economic activities. If those get disrupted because of social tensions, then you're seeing the possibility of quite serious damage. Yes. Well, it so happens that I was in on the birth. I used to be the economic advisor to the Ministry of Information Technology in 1990 through 94. So I was in fact, one of the architects of the 1990 software policy and the 1991 software technology park policy. It is not true that a policy did not exist. There was a 1979 software policy which made sure that Indian software sector was hamstrung. It made us uncompetitive in world markets, right? The 1990 software policy was a very simple document. You can access it, it's there. It simply did away with the 1979 policy, saying that this has outlived its utility, let's just scrap it. So yes, in a sense it is. We pulled the government back, but it was a deliberate step by the government. It did not happen by itself. It's not that the software sector just came under the radar screen and sort of somehow squeaked its way through. There was a deliberate act on the part of government to remove those limitations. But what they will also perhaps not mention, the single largest problem that the software sector faced when they tried to come out was the fact that no bank was willing to give them working capital. No bank. The reason is they didn't have collateral. It was the government which actually talked with the banks to extend loans to the software sector against firm orders received. So it was collateralizing an order rather than a physical commodity. This was a huge step for Indian banking, and a lot of the developments you've seen after that really emerged from this. This happened only for the software sector initially. So it was the government and the RBI which worked on this. The software people forget this. I mean, they think they kind of did it all by themselves, but it really is not true.